Hello, everybody. Welcome this Sunday morning for me to May of the Moderns week 4. Can you believe it? We're already 4 weeks into May. So thanks for joining us on the channel today. You're on booktube. I forgot my little intro. On the channel today, I have a very special guest. We'll be talking about the 4th prompt of May of the Moderns, End of Empire. And in case you didn't know, the May of the Moderns readathon deals with books written or published between 1901, when the Victorian age ended, and 1945, when World War II ended, just to give us some goalposts. And so we're going to be talking about empire themes in literature and some of the books we may have read and some of the background we may have picked up this year in digesting this information. So without any further ado, because I'm sure we'll get to coming attractions in a moment, I'm going to introduce my special guest, Rhys of Scallydandling About the Books, which is a delightful channel name. Hello, Rhys.
Hi. Hello, Margaret. Thank you for inviting me.
So happy to have you.
Yeah, it's so strange to meet you, if you know what I mean, because you've been around, and we've talked quite a lot in comments and so on, but this is the first time we've properly met.
Right. Yeah, on the screen. So yeah, it's always a bit strange to talk to people in your head, and like, you know, when they say they wave on screen and you wave back even though you're not in the picture. Same kind of thing. Exactly. So now we're here and we're excited to talk about your prompt. So let me read that out. I did remember to get this ahead of time. Read a book set in a place that was an imperial possession at the time of the moderns that we defined, or by an author from a place that was. So we've got lots of possibilities there, because not only are there many empires, you're doing both sides of the coin. So lots of possibilities. Can you actually start us off by telling us about your scallydandling book goal? Because I think that interlaces with this prompt really well.
I guess it does. Yeah, I called my channel Scallydandling About the Books because, well, scallydandling is a word from Sussex that means to like go about the place having fun and maybe slightly up to no good, you know, but
okay.
You know, without being not wicked, you know, just like, you know, out having a bit of a lark. But I chose that because I've got a kind of long-term personal project to read a book by an author from every country in the world, and that's led me up all sorts of interesting kind of different alleyways to different authors and different countries and different styles of literature and different periods, and so yeah, it's a particular interest of mine, I guess, to get about a bit.
Yeah, and it feels like you've had to go through several layers of book buying channels to find the translations and whatever you need to like get those hard to reach countries. So yeah. Kudos.
Well, I'm down to I'm nearly down to under 12. I hope by the end of this year to be down to fewer than 20 countries left to go, but we'll see if I get there.
That's fast. That's fast, because the
I've been doing it for years. It's no fuss.
Okay. Well, there's a book show on A Mighty Blaze that does Authors Love Bookstores, and they've been aiming to do a bookstore from every state in the US and, you know, some of the possessions, speaking of empire, as well. And I think they have like a dozen left, and they've been doing it for 2 years. But unfortunately, they keep clustering in the same places. You know, it's like Chicago and Brooklyn and California, and those get over and over. So same kind of problem. Yes, they're trying to branch out.
The great thing though is that every I get that there's places that I'm stuck on, but then someone translates something new. It's brilliant.
There you go. Yeah, you get people suggesting things because you're putting your ambition out there, and then you get like the network. Yes. So I want to say hi to people in the chat. Anita is here. Cool Gamer is here. Melissa is here. Shannon is here. Oh my gosh, we got lots of people here. It's a good Sunday to pick. Yeah.
Hi,
yay! Brian is here. Brian, our guest from last week. Hello. So yeah, thanks for being here, everybody. Let's dive in. I've got some questions outlined, but of course you are welcome to put some in the comments yourself. And we'll try to answer those as we go. So my first question, I have two, and I can't decide which is the best way like the best order to ask these in. So let me just start with, what did you hope to draw out as themes from having people read a book set in or by an author from an imperial possession country?
I think when you sort of asked me to think about a prompt, and I was thinking about this period, you know, that first half of the 20th century, and I think one of the most interesting things about that period is that it's such a period of change between, you know, like we think of the 18th and 19th centuries as being the big period for particularly European overseas empires. But actually, most of them were at their biggest. They were at their peak, like early in the 20th century. You know, like the British Empire, that was at its biggest around 1920. The French, you know, the Russian empire. You know, so it's kind of like we're at peak empire, but at the same time, we're just at that point, that tipping point, when there's more and more sort of nationalism and national independence movements in the places that are you know controlled by those big empires. So and that really you know seeps into the literature of the period, I think. So I thought, hey, let's explore that a bit, and then obviously you want to get it from both sides,
right,
as it were, but not in a, it's never as simple as you think, if you know what I mean, but we'll get onto that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay, so and then the second question, which I figured was a little wrapped up in that, was in what ways is Victorian literature, so pre-peak but still very engaged, different from modern literature in our period where we're calling it end of empire? What do you think are some major differences that you could call out?
I mean, I think when we say sort of pre-peak, I mean like that when you've got kind of like growth and a kind of like obviously the British Empire is the one that I'm most familiar with, but I think you could say the same for French, German, Belgian in kind of in the 19th century. You know, it's all about expansion. It's all about getting, the Russians as well, all about getting control, and a sort of like an imperial project, put it that way. And you feel that in some of the literature, even when it isn't explicitly about that. You know, there's this sort of confidence and arrogance, I suppose. That, you know, so even in a writer like well, let's say Trollope, you know, which you don't think of as a writer that really writes about imperial issues, but it's there implicitly and gets little mentions. And you know, it's like, you know, or if you go all the way back to Austen, you know, it's where's people's money coming from? Where does the second son go off to make their fortune? Or where do you send the black sheep? Well, you probably send them to Australia, actually. So that's implicit. Whereas in the 20th century, and in our period, you know, the modern period, it's about questioning. Like doubt kind of creeps in a different way. And I mean, I think and you have to interrupt me at times, Margaret, because you know once you get me going, you know. But
I'm trying to hang on to the things that I want to respond to. I'm like, oh, don't forget that point. Don't forget that. Yeah.
But I mean, I think so. Let's think about Kipling, okay, Rudyard Kipling, which I'm sure lots of people will have read. You know, things 19th century things by Kipling, and then he kind of carries over into the early 20th century, and he's sometimes described as like an apologist for the British Empire, and particularly the empire in India. But you know, he grows up, you know, his early childhood is in India, and he has a sort of huge affection and enthusiasm for India, but he sees it as just completely natural that the British should rule India. You know, he's unquestioning that it's just obviously right and appropriate and a good thing, you know. But by the time you get a book like Kim, which is in our period, you can see the tensions and the stresses, even in a writer like Kipling, who's like full on, you know, yay, let's be there and do this, you know, and it's our right to do so. It's creeping in. And then by the time you get to, say, Forster, and like A Passage to India, you really see the difference. That like by that point, it's like, oh, yes, we're still there and we're still in charge, but is this right? Are we right to be doing this? That, you know, the doubt, right. and the sort of feeling of the tension is, it ramps up.
Right. I started out in my like mini lectures talking about this as a period of disillusionment, and I have since been turned upside down in the race and class discussion because there was less disillusionment among the marginalized populations because they never had it to fall from. And then Brian turned me upside down again with the disillusionment of like, well, they're no longer second-class citizens in a different country, so they're disillusioned about their own country, so they bring that back when they've had international experience. And then like this other it's like popcorn machine, I'm back on this because when you talk about having that doubt seep in from the imperial side, I think, okay, so now it's getting to be the overreach when the sort of like boom and bust cycle of empire is being retracted. And it's sort of like an Icarus period. Maybe that's what we call this, is like they're flying too close to the sun. Yeah.
But the flip side of that is that, you know, in country after country, or that weren't yet countries, place after place in those imperial possessions, you're getting people with a kind of growing confidence about their you know, maybe writing in their language and capturing their culture that might have been an oral one and getting it down on paper and giving it weight, tied together with their, you know, political aspirations for independence. So you know, you've got one set of, you know, it's the scales are kind of finely balanced and they're about to tip the other way.
Right. And the thing that you mentioned before when it's not simple is that I think part of the imperial project is that the education is exported. And so you get people in countries who are growing up learning about and idolizing traditions that are not theirs. And so then they're sort of torn between what values do I what do I value? What do I look up to? Is it my native project and culture and traditions, or is it this that is valued in the world that will get me further, that will get me money, and like how they cross connect?
And then making a choice then about what language you write in was really crucial, because obviously, and I mean, this, you know, this carries on beyond our period, that question in writers' minds, because, like, you know, if you write in English, you've got a much bigger audience potentially, you know, whereas you know, if you you know, honor your own language, you're you know, you may be
exposure, right?
So, and I think like India again would be, you know, the classic country to think about that, where you get some writers, you know, in our period, writing in English, you know, quite a lot. And I mean, I suggested Narayan, he's sort of towards the end of the period, as one of our sort of, you know, possible books or authors to pick up on for this prompt. But at the same time, you've got people that are, you know, you've got the Bengali Renaissance with people like Tagore and Chattopadhyay, whose novel I've read for this year's May of the Moderns.
Oh, okay. Nice.
Yeah, that's one that I picked up. You know, or people choosing to write in Hindi or in Urdu, you know, and which is really, you know, and of course there were literary traditions for them to turn back to, but you know, it would have been more natural, or where they'd have got more exposure, and they may well have been educated, as you say, in English, and you know, so.
And that's a hard choice. So we're getting far. I'm getting way behind in the chat, so I just want to say hello to the people that are coming in. Jim, hello. Alba made it. Hola. Maggie, hello.
Hi, Alba.
Foxed Folios, hello, is the Instagram participant in the readathon. Excellent. Maggie is stream hopping, so she's put in the little hashtag stream hoppers unite. It's cute. So Alba mentioned U.S. imperialism, por favor, and I want to touch on this because when one of the things I asked, and Roz gave me, you know, a rundown of some of the empires to pick from, which I could rattle off. But the ones that I'm reading that I found to apply were American imperialist examples, and I thought only fair to mention that, you know, America's sordid past is there as well. So yeah. Maggie said, "You've come to the right place if you're chatty." We love that. Brian said, "You know, there's no such thing as American imperialism. That's just manifest destiny and making the world safe for democracy." Tongue firmly in cheek. Thank you, Brian. Jim says, "Is there a book written and set in Ireland between the wars, between the Easter Rising and the formal independence?" So this is actually the question that came up. In case anyone in the chat knows, this would be the crowd to ask, because when we were talking about war and the sort of cross-cutting loyalties of empire and on all that stuff, we were wondering if someone has written a book, because that would be really interesting to satisfy all our problems at once.
Yeah.
So think on that if anyone has a recommendation. Alba says, "I forgot." Sorry. Yeah, we're laughing in the comments. Excellent. And Alba says, "Also interested in Ireland." Okay, so we'll hope someone can come back, or I'll do some research. That's a good line of inquiry for me as well. Oh, and I wanted to point out, I put this on Instagram. This is my dress up for the thing today, because it's Empire Waist. And it's vaguely from the period, so I thought I would contribute that. Yes.
Oh, I mean, I think some of the one of the things that I was thinking about when I did the prompt was, you know, obviously, you know, as an English woman, the British Empire is the one that I'm most familiar with, but I'm very conscious that that was absolutely not the only empire active in the period we're talking about. And I think it was interesting what Brian just said about the American imperialism, you know, not existing, because I'll be really interested if anyone in the comments can add to my understanding about this. But you know, I've read a fair amount of French literature in translation, and they don't seem in this period to have the same hang-ups about their empire that the British were beginning to. I mean, you get it later when you've got like the Algerian War of Independence, right, or you know, much. But at this point, the French still seem to be in that place of like, hey, well, it's all France, really. You know, half the time they didn't even call it empire. They just said, oh, well, this is just overseas bits of France.
Yeah.
And and I honestly haven't seen that same struggle. But I may just have not read the right French literature, so maybe someone else will.
Yeah, I can't remember where I heard it now, but just recently in the past couple of days, I remember someone mentioning the fact that, and this may have been post World War II, so out of our time period, but the fact that they didn't mention race, so they couldn't ask it on official documents because they didn't want to fall into that trap. But then they're in a different trap where they're not addressing any of the cultural differences or cultural priorities, such as in your education or in your healthcare choices or any of these sorts of things. So dicey. I mean, dicey any way you do it. Yeah.
But at the same time, I know there were people in French colonies, you know, starting, you know, to write. They were being maybe educated in French, but some of them, and a lot of them, they tended, like someone like Senghor, you know, oh goodness, Alba might help me out with I've forgotten the word for negritude. That's it, negritude. That sort of movement. You know, but that they actually sort of used the fact that they all spoke the Francophone states in Africa, used the fact that they had a common language in French to kind of come together with their sort of nationalist movements. So yeah, which, as I say, is why it's none of this is simple.
Yeah, I know why I just read that thing about the Constitution in France. It was because I was listening to Shay with the Hobbies, and she had a discussion on her channel where they were talking about words in Black culture being used outside, and racism with Agatha Christie, with her title especially. And she said that it was changed in French so many years, so many decades afterwards. But she fought it, and my memory of the words describing Black people in college, I mean, is not great. So I went and looked it up, and I found this NPR article that talks all about how people in France are re-educating people to use words differently. Just kind of like how words change their meanings in our culture now so quickly as well. And it was fascinating. So I will find that and put that in the chat afterwards. Let's see. The next question I had is a little tangly. Was has empire ended? In what ways or not? So this is like, yeah.
Oh, well, now, unlike Brian, I'm not a historian, but no, obviously it hasn't. You know, it just morphs, doesn't it, into different forms. And you know, where that is particularly interesting at the moment, I would say, is around Russia. Mm-hmm. You know, because, you know, just thinking of current events. So you know, we don't always think of you know, that there was a Russian empire, but there was, you know, they control, you know, they took in the 19th century, well, early, but they took, you know, Central Asia, you know, countries that are now countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and, you know, all of that, Azerbaijan, Georgia, you know, but also obviously the biggie, you know, for current events, Ukraine, you know, was part of a Russian empire. And then, whereas in other places, those you know, countries started becoming independent, when they became part of the USSR, the Soviet Union, they were all then tied in a different way. And there's some interesting literature around that, but we could come back to that. But you know, what you're seeing now is the Russians thinking, essentially, they're looking to get some of their empire back, aren't they? Mm-hmm. You know, you know, and that's the, you know, why they're currently in Ukraine.
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit about the mindset of the imperialists and like the confidence and arrogance and then doubtful questioning. And it feels like we've come full circle because Russia is in that position of confidence and, you know, thinking that's the right thing in some circles, you know? Yeah, interesting.
Absolutely. Compared with, you know, 89, 90 and the breakup of the Soviet Union, when they lost their confidence and all these, you know, places got independence. There's a book that I'd like to recommend to people, really interesting book, called Ali and Nino, A Love Story, and it was published in 1937, but probably written a bit earlier, and it's a book from Azerbaijan, and the author is Kurban Said, but that was a pseudonym, and actually there's a bit of a mystery about who the author was, but it was probably someone called Chamanzam Neely.
Okay.
Challenging Azerbaijani name that I've probably completely messed up, but he was like a writer and a sort of political figure in Azerbaijan. Now, Azerbaijan was like, you know, it had gone from it was a place with its own language and so on, but it had gone from being part of the Persian, you know, control into.
I think of it as like right next to Turkey and next to like that danger zone. Yeah,
it's near Armenia and Georgia, and you know, it's in that bit, and Iran, and so and then it becomes controlled by the Russians. It's part of the Tsarist Russian Empire. Then just briefly it gets a little bit around 1918 to 1920 it's an independent country for like about 2 years. And the book Ali and Nino, it is a love story. It's a kind of a romantic story, but it's about these two young people from Azerbaijan, one sort of Orthodox Christian, Georgian Christian, and one Muslim, who fall in love and then come together in that moment when Azerbaijan gets its independence, and then are pulled apart when the Soviets sort of, you know, move in, and it's a lovely, it's, if you want to read something from somewhere that you wouldn't expect to read something from and have a really rewarding experience there's a recommendation. And it's all about that one empire ending, a little bit of independence, and then the new empire taking control.
Sweeping social movements, we love that.
Oh, we do.
Sweeping history, and then like how that trickles down into people's lives and like turns them around. Definitely. Absolutely. Speaking of which, I write books about British Empire, imperial possessions, and how that affects the little guys trying to just stay on the farm and keep their family together. So here's my little plug. I'll pop it up here to say like, comment, subscribe, check out the books that I have, historical fiction novels. So they're down in the description below if anyone is interested. That is a great rec. So I'm going to catch up on the chat, and then I'm going to bring up my American Empire things to satisfy Alba here. So I keep going back here. There we go. So Jim was saying he recommended Far, Far Away by Sebastian Barry, which is historical fiction about that dilemma we were talking about, Irish soldiers in the First World War. Contemporary author. Shannon was mentioning love empire waist dresses and shirts. I have big hips. Feel seen, right? It helps my curvy figure, me as well. And then Maggie was chiming in on American imperialism. If the U.S. pulled out of all territories and aid packages or tax dollars would go so much further to help the homeless at home and poor who can't find baby formula. Well, I think the baby formula thing is a market thing as well as a trade. When I say thing, I guess I mean situation or snafu.
But I think, one of the things about, when your question about, are there still empires, and like the United States has tended to almost have an empire by proxy rather than directly, hasn't it? So it sets up almost like, client states rather than that, with the exception of like, well, I know Alba will talk about Puerto Rico as the colony, but for around the world but then the other, there's the sort of cultural and commercial empires that we have now, isn't there?
Right. So pure economics. But I think when you say by proxy, that makes me start thinking about the IMF and like the dependency. That's what I studied in grad school. And that whole like, well, if you obey our market demands, we'll give you debt. And then you're captured two ways, because now you didn't get to make your own economic choices for your nation and you have debt to these people. So yeah, not great. Richard Holiday. Hello, fellow Brit here. Fox Folios on writing in English, quite a significant Indian contingent writing largely in English. Narayan, as you said, Raja Rao, Mulk Raj Anand. Fox Folios put a bunch of titles down at the bottom of the spreadsheet, so definitely check that out. I'll pop it in the chat.
A big thumbs up for short stories by Anand.
Nice. Yeah, better short story recommending than I am, because I can't get into a lot of them. So yeah, thank you for that. Here we go. So here is where they put their short stories. If you want to check it out in the spreadsheet.
The short stories written not in English, but in one of the languages of the Indian subcontinent that I really enjoyed was Ismat Chughtai's short stories. Definitely. And that oh yes.
Yeah, I found this in a used bookstore, like Treasure, right?
Yeah.
There's only the first couple that are in our period, so I read those and then I stopped, and they were quite bewildering, I will say. So yes, but very interesting.
For me, she's right up there as a sort of modernist short story writer. And she was writing in Urdu.
Let's see. Albus says, I remember you mentioning Sebastian Barry. Yep, from Brian's Live. Gracias. Jim says Putin's war in Ukraine, imperialistic, totally. Brian saying, I think we should shoot for a sweet spot between imperialism and isolationism. Yeah, between looking out for American interests and embracing internationalism. It's all about the balance. Yeah, Russia controlling 20% of Georgia. I went back and changed a word meaning person of non-French, white and black parentage from Louisiana to a different designation because 5 years ago the word had one meaning and now is tied to hate speak. Interesting. Yeah, exactly. That's how fast it changes and evolves. So you gotta keep abreast of all the developments. Yep, changes far faster than it did. I'm feeling this too. Berna says Agatha Christie title was changed very, very recently in Turkish, but we like the Black community so much the translated word actually did not have the same negative meaning in Turkish. Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. It depends on whatever country and their history with race, and yeah, that is true. Brian, not sure we'll ever get there, but it would be nice if we at least tried. Seriously. Maggie says it'd be nice if territories could pay taxes and vote too, but I doubt that will happen in our lives. Yeah, I mean, first DC and Puerto Rico in one amendment. That would be nice. That would be nice. Jim says there's a statue of Ali and Nino in Batumi, Georgia. Nino was Georgian in the story. Oh, cool. There you go.
Yeah, she's like Georgian Christian, isn't she? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I just lost a bunch
of comments. And Ali's like Azeri Muslim.
Yeah. So supporting movements for independence. Brenna says, sounds like a very good book. Alba wants to read that book. Alba saying we pay more than our share of taxes and our economy serves the empire. That's why the U.S. won't leave us alone. Yeah. Yeah. Again, the dependence model. That's starting in the 19th century and still going strong, just in a different way. Yeah. Yep. Territories is the new euphemism for colonies. Alba is not for statehood. All right. All right. And we've got back and forth in the comments. Oh, hot debate here. Not sure if it's what you're looking for, but Sean O'Casey's play The Plow and the Stars might be. It's a trio of plays. That's an interesting suggestion. I definitely have heard of that. Yeah.
I think, yes, probably like might be aware of more poetry from Ireland than the novels that really address those issues. You know, like Yeats sort of goes there, doesn't he? But yeah.
And one of the things you mentioned in our conversation that ties in last week's discussion was
Claude McKay.
Claude McKay. Yeah, yeah. So the first resource that I found called him West Indian American, which is needlessly opaque. He's Jamaican American, but he also spent time in London at first, and so he's in all the places.
Yeah, I mean, he you know, he's born, grew up in Jamaica. You know, he's Jamaican, and then he lives in France for a bit, in England for a bit, and then settles in the States. So to become part of the Harlem Renaissance, but he was very definitely you know, he first became an author in Jamaica, and I think because he was writing, that was how he got kind of he got to move, you know, move abroad and have
education, you know, and yeah.
A few people took him under their wing because he was writing, but his writing when he was in Jamaica, he was writing using quite a bit of patois, and then he sort of shifts once he's living in the States. But I was so intrigued by the poem that you quoted last week. That's why I kind of looked for it and then looked him up. And now I'm really interested to read his book, Banjo, which he wrote, I think he wrote it in the 30s, I think, but it's looking back a bit, and it's about a group of black seamen, sailors, who are all in Marseille, and they're a mixture of like from French, West African possessions, British possessions, and the Caribbean, and different, you know, and they're all kind of living and mixing in Marseille. And I thought, it definitely looks that's a must read now for me, I think.
Yeah. I'm definitely interested in him too. So like this, I put as DNF on Storygraph, and that means that they're not going to count it for my prompt. So I had to find another book, but I did have one on my pile of possibilities. So this is as good as place as any to put in the American things that I found. So I'm reading The Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston for the Asian readathon, which is not connected to May of the Moderns, but this is a Chinese Hawaiian author who writes about a lot of like Chinese cultural handed down things, but she wrote it in the 60s about from a Hawaiian background. And so I was like, oh, let me Google the American coup that happened in Hawaii in 1893. So that was interesting. And then I was thinking about reading this. I started reading Not Without Laughter and was like, well, Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. Let's read a double, two people who were contemporaries but went separate ways. And this is Tell My Horse. It's a collection of folk tales, a bit about the voodoo practices, a bit about the political upheavals in the West Indies in the 1920s and 30s. And she goes right into all these upheavals in Haiti. And I didn't know that America occupied Haiti from 1915 to 1934, but like, we're not taught that. Yeah. I mean, I knew they had post World War II actions there and like disaster relief stuff, but this is a little peek that I didn't know about. So there were after effects of that, obviously, and she goes into it, and it's fascinating stuff. So there's that. So there's Hawaii, there's Haiti, and then well, I'm reading this, and this is a bit more of a distant thing, but the Empire of the Railroad and the tentacles that it creeps over the continent. So, yeah. So really interesting stuff about empire that just creeps into all of the reading. I feel like that is one of the lessons, is that it was affecting everything, and so the deeper you look, the more pieces you find that are related. How about, go ahead.
I was thinking about what you said earlier about authors who are sort of living in countries that are under imperial control and are exposed to a kind of mix of cultural influences as a result, their own and those of the imperial powers. And I was thinking about Nahguib Mahfouz. So he's an Egyptian writer. He was the first, in fact, the first sort of writer in Arabic to get a Nobel Prize for Literature, and he started writing in our period. Some of his best known books are just after our period, but he was writing in the 1930s, and so when he was born, Egypt was still technically part of the Ottoman Empire. So a dying empire at that point, but basically the British had moved in and taken over, and it was effectively British controlled at the time when he was a child. And then in 1990, so he was born, he was about 1911, I think he was born, 1910, 1911. So when he was a young child, he saw the Egyptian uprising, like they had a revolution attempted against British control, and he saw British soldiers shooting people on the streets of Cairo. He was a boy, looking out of the windows of his house to see this and so on. But his mix of influences is what's so interesting, because his mother used to take him to see the pyramids. You had the whole kind of history of ancient Egypt that the Egyptian people were starting to reclaim and say, hey, we have this amazing history. Then there were sort of other Egyptian writers, but we know he was reading Tolstoy, he was reading Dickens, he was reading like American detective stories. He was obviously a little magpie of a child, reading all these different, and also all those influences come into his books, and that's I suppose that's quite exciting to me. But he started out writing books that were actually based in ancient Egypt. So he wrote historical fiction like you, but he was writing historical fiction of the days of the pharaohs, as an Egyptian, whilst Egypt was still kind of in effect controlled by the British. He only started writing about that period, the period of his lifetime, after the British had definitively left. Well, they were still in Suez, but that's another complication. It's like that. How long do you have to leave it before you feel able to write? So he wrote about that whole thing of the British suppressing this uprising in Cairo and so on, but not until after the Second World War.
Safety first. So that's two.
Writing yeah, but writing about the pharaohs was, was very much about Egyptian identity and in the face of being, controlled. They were a protectorate. That's what we did.
Two books in very important moments. So the Azerbaijani example is that 2 years of independence between outer control, and then this one, he's writing about early cultural resources for Egypt in a moment that is unrest and upheaval. And I think that's great. I mean, that makes me think of, like, if I was to think of Turkey and someone who was like pre-Republic days, thinking back to the great heroes and using that as a, sort of stick to show people, like, here's the thing. This is what we could be again. Or that's, I mean, in the wrong hands, it's propaganda, but in the right moment or with the right intention, it's, reclaiming your own nationhood and sovereignty. That's
language and history is usually what makes people feel like they're a nation. And writing, literature has this special power, in fact, to kind of capture that and share it for people. I'm thinking about, so somewhere like Kazakhstan, like at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, before that they'd all their literature was oral, and then people start actually writing it down then, and that's part of why Kazakhs start to think, oh, we're a thing. If you're a nomadic pastoralist, country,
right, writing from the saddle,
Kazakh literature, so
interesting. Because they're being seen on the international stage. I suppose you can have a sense of yourself, but if no one outside is recognizing you, it feels less,
but also about your own confidence in yourself. So this is beyond our period, but it's really interesting. I don't know if you know, but the debate between Chinua Achebe, who chose to write in English, and Ngugi Thiong'o, I'm probably getting those pronounced right, Kenyan writer who started writing English and then switched.
And I don't know that one. So
so it's like, hang on a minute, just because I was taught English at school, actually I need to write in my language because it's part of our nationhood,
Right.
Yeah.
Powerful stuff. Let's see if you've got the questions, pick, I guess, what you're most interested in. What about Melissa had this question that she submitted during the sprints, which is, how is it different to read a novel set in the country versus a novel written by an author from that country? So the one perspective versus the other in your prompt. If you want to use an example in that one, is what I was hoping for, because
but I'm thinking about this, and it's like, I mean, again, we're back to identity, aren't we? And there's a difference between so when Kipling writes about India, he feels a deep personal attachment. He doesn't see himself as kind of like almost like a visitor. He sees it as somewhere that he's really connected to, even if the people, Indians would think, no, you're this colonizer, you know what I mean. And then you get writers in the Caribbean, in the English speaking bits of the Caribbean, is the bits that I'm familiar with. You get a writer, Jean Rhys. Now, people know Jean Rhys for The Wide Sargasso Sea, which she wrote later in life, but she was writing in our period. And so she grew up in Dominica, not just grew up, but her family had been there for, a couple of hundred years. She was, Creole, as in, she felt that was her place, and when she wrote, there's a book that she wrote, Voyage in the Dark, where it's about a young woman or sort of teenage girl who's sent to England, and feels like she's been banished from this idyllic place that she belongs. And it's almost like in that in that work. Oh, excellent.
Yeah, it's on my overflowing list, so I'm not gonna get
but it's like there, like England and London is the sort of nasty, cold, unfriendly, unkind, and she's sort of harking back to her Caribbean home as the the rich, warm, special place. So it's not always, I suppose, again, nothing is ever so very, very simple. And and then you have like some Caribbean writers who genuinely saw, misguidedly we'd say now, but saw like Britain as like the motherland that would that they wanted to go to and that would welcome them, and saw themselves as being part of that. How they found out how wrong they were when they actually came here, and everyone treated them really appallingly. But
yeah, This Lovely City was great for that. That's a historical fiction that just came out a couple of years ago. That's about a crime. It's a mystery novel that happens just the year after the ship comes to bring all these workers from Jamaica, and they're disillusioned, but in the original sense that I imagined. Yeah.
So but for me, it's I feel it's really important for me to read books by people that are from somewhere, and preferably I will read things that are written in English if that's what is available, but ideally, actually, I'm really interested in reading things that are translated from the language of that place, because language just carries so much culture, and if you've got a good translation, you get as a reader, you get something different, don't you, from there's a sort of a nuance and oh, I can see a message from Tilly. Hi, Tilly.
Speaking of language and like identity, Tilly's Shelf, who is a related channel, shall we say, there's an aspect of that with Ukraine.
I can say it's my daughter.
Poets writing in Ukrainian were creating a national identity even when the nation itself was divided or controlled by others. So yeah, getting at the nation feeling with literature and poetry is a good point. Alba remembers that book by Jean Rhys. So complicated. Yeah. I did talk a little bit about that on the other end of the line. So if you think about people who grew up somewhere but are the plantation or the planters or the colonizers in that space and feel out of step, going back to like where they belong because they don't belong there. The panel I did like over a year ago, but it's still something that I think about, is like people's definition of home and where they feel at home, and how that is sometimes an enormous privilege, because where you feel at home and where you want to be, and if you are allowed to be there, is such a privilege. So we talked a lot about that in terms of writing about places as well. So I'll pop that up later. Foxfolio definitely spans beyond our period, but has anyone else read Shakespeare in Swahili Land by E. Wilson Lee? Nope. It's an interesting title. In Georgia in Soviet times, the Georgians demonstrated to keep Georgian as the sole state language. Demonstrations took place throughout the country. Interesting. Nia is here. Hello. And demonstrations reached a zenith in Tbilisi on 14th April 1978, where thousands of people took to the streets. Wow. Barrett's here lurking. Shakespeare in Swahili Land includes some fascinating information about how native populations in Africa effectively weaponized Shakespeare, quintessential English lit, in various struggles for rights, independence. Interesting. So in that video from Shay that I highlighted earlier about the word for Black people in different countries that led to me to that NPR article, they were talking about Shakespeare. Like, why can't we listen to the people who have written in our own vernacular? Why are we always going back to like the be all end all and Shakespeare? And why is there never a progression? It's kind of like in American history, we're always taught the same things and it ends at World War II. And we never hear about like up to our present day. And you're like, there's something missing there and we haven't addressed it. Although I don't know, it's been a minute since I've been in school, so maybe they changed things. I don't know.
Oh no, I think that certainly in the school system here, they're just obsessed with teaching World War I and World War II, as if nothing anything else interesting ever happened.
Yeah. It's like take a paper bag full of other topics and pull one out and just do different units. I mean, education is much more complicated than that, I know, but like the new things need to be incorporated. So yeah.
Oh, now I know that Alba is watching, and I know she's sort of better read around Caribbean authors than I am. But when I was looking up Claude McKay, I came across a woman writer called Una Marson from Jamaica, and she was sort of born at the beginning of our period, and she was writing poetry, and she was a Jamaican feminist poet, apparently, of that time. But I haven't read anything by her, so I thought, well, if anyone's going to have done it, it would be Alba. But
Una, what's her last name?
Una Masson. Marson? I'm sure it's Marson. Marson or Marson? Marson. Yeah.
Marson. Okay.
Is it Marson?
Marson. I just found it. I just Googled.
You found her? Yeah.
Yeah. Alva's got it. Alva's locked it down. Una Marson. And that's just what I found on Google. So yeah, Una Maud Victoria Marson. Nice. Yeah, great find. So see, we love these scallydandling recommendations.
And this is the joy of May of the Moderns, you see, Margaret, because you get me finding, you know, writers that I've never heard of, you know, that because of the problems and because of the themes, you know, so it's, you know, that thank you for giving us this little extra stimulation, you know.
Yeah, I'm
going to be off reading Claude McKay and Una Marson now.
There we go. We're set for the next little bit. One we haven't touched on was a question earlier from Fox Folio's non-European empires for the period. Japan seems to be the most obvious example. Do you have recommendations to like take us out in another sphere entirely? Because I did just read Pachinko Along with Gemma, and that's historical fiction instead of like of the period, but it points to where you might look for things.
And it's really interesting. Good old Fox Folios, I think, for bringing this up, because when you look at which empires were actually expanding in the period that we're talking about, you know, we're talking about end of empire and, you know, empire shrinking. The real obvious expanding empire at this point is the Japanese one. You know, they've kind of like taken control of Korea, you know, and, you know, and then Manchuria, and so, you know, they're in their real, you know, and the peak of the Japanese empire was sort of during World War II. So but I'm not well read in either Japanese literature or, you know, I've read a bit of Korean literature, but mostly sort of latter part of the 20th century or into the 21st. So we need other people. I mean, one of the things that I really hoped when I made the prompt quite broad, I was hoping that people who, you know, have experience of other empires, as it were, you know, wherever they live, whether, you know, would come up with different suggestions, you know, because we don't all need to read Kipling, The Passage to India, and Tagore. You know, it's like, you know.
yeah. But and here's an interesting one I found. So America, the last American empire possession, I found a really great article because Haiti, Hawaii, and the Philippines. So I was thinking, okay, the Philippines, let's see, our dates are 1898 to 1946 when it was occupied by the US. And that's a substantial period, the whole period of the moderns that we're looking at. And I found this great article that actually goes through the effect of the American occupation on literature. And I was like, this is too perfect. So for the Americans who want to learn about their own backyard, this is a great pointer to resources to look up, because it has all these names and all these like significant in the poetry, in the plays, and why, and like whether they were in English, or they chose to do it in, you know, like the colonizer language and reasons. So nationalist lit, I'll put that in. Long link, so I hope that goes in one comment. But yeah. So Alba says it's first time, but she's added her as well. Una Marson, excellent. Jenna's calling out my Queen of Books you've never heard of, which is something I try to do on the channel. What else do we have? We're running out of time here.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of anything else that I really wanted to talk about. We talked about Ireland. No one's answered my question about the French, have they? About the French and how they sort of don't seem to have written about it.
I'm sure some academic French person has analyzed this, though. I'm sure it's like something no one reads except like in the academy. Yeah.
No, you're probably right.
So just the last call for questions from the audience. If you had recommendations for people or questions for Roz. I had a question about what you learn at school. Jenna, the soul writer, in the comments, and I were back and forth a little bit about our education systems, Americans, which I feel like no one is satisfied with. But British Empire and what you learned, you said that you learned about World War I and World War II. Is there anything about Empire that's been added, do you think?
I mean, no, I didn't learn so much about World War I and World War II. That's now. That's all they did. You know, all they teach kids now. But whereas I think we learned a lot about the 18th century and about the sort of the growth of the British Empire. Like when my mother was at school in the 20s and 30s, they had Empire Day. It was a big event once a year when they'd all go and do a procession and put on foot back how splendid the British Empire was,
right,
Empire Day thing, and they were to be proud of it, But by the time I was at school in the at the end of the 60s and then 1970s, like it was stumm, because that was the point when it was all breaking up. We were handing it back or handing it over, or and nobody talked about. We were only now fully hearing about how, say, we behaved in Kenya, putting down the Mau Mau uprising that kind of ultimately led to Kenya becoming independent. So no, we didn't learn it. We learned in school about it, sort of, how it made Britain rich, I guess. But then there was a sort of eerie silence about
silence. Yeah.
That's it.
That's interesting. Yeah, because one of the things that I think we can look at across empires and across countries' experience is how they deal with that past if they've been colonizers in any way. Because I feel like one of the main problems in America today, not to be broad at all, but is like not confronting the original sin of the country and like slavery and the racism and the underpinnings, right? And so when we look at other countries and think, wow, that's so open-minded of Australia or Canada to have a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, or I forget what the one is called in Australia for the Indigenous, but processes that actually address, and South Africa's committee, and the sort of first time anything like that happens, but we don't seem able to do it in our cases. There's isolated apologies. There was a apology to Hawaii that was in the late 90s, I think, for the coup. And you're like, well, they're a state now. Like, it's just sort of like mealy-mouthed, I guess is the word that comes to mind. But I feel like there's a big effort that needs to be done, and it's not being done. So maybe literature will help us get to it.
And certainly in this country, I think one of the problems with us not now teaching children about the kind of empire we had is that people not understand, the reason that Britain is now this sort of, multiracial society is predominantly because we had that empire, but people, so people see these, people as interlopers, when actually it's like, and forget that, well, that was because, we're, as they say, we're over here because you were over there, as it were.
Yeah, there you go. Yes, that is the saying of the night. I love it. Oh gosh. Yeah, yeah, that's good. So we got people in chat. Maggie saying, lovely to meet you. I think she's going to another stream. Alba saying, going to read Rizal's Noli Me Tangere. Where's that?
Thank you.
Pacific. That sounds good. I will be looking that up as well. Jim says, France seems lagging behind. Women really granted voting rights in France in 1945. In terms of questioning the supremacist sort of position. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine like Proust, was fretting about,
memory,
where the vanilla in his Madeleines came from, that it was coming from Madagascar and the French Empire.
Yeah. Actually, it's funny because having empire in mind and preparing for this, I had the baking show for A Mighty Blaze yesterday was caramelized banana bread, and I was like, why is banana bread a thing in America? Why is it a big thing? Okay, the Depression and making use of the food, but why did we have so many bananas? We can't grow them here. Banana republics, colonialism. so everything's relating, right? Melissa's pointing out an interesting podcast, which I listened to on Audible, maybe, was called We Need to Talk About the British Empire, or maybe it's a docu-series. And Julie's recommending that too. Yeah, good recommendation. Taking a popular phrase and using it for the British Empire. And Mark here, Book Time with Elvis, welcome. Grew up in a British colony that's still a colony today, and in the 80s, they were proud of it for sure, though things have changed now. Interesting. Yeah. The culture.
I'm wondering where that was. Is Mark?
I can't remember. I'm gonna say Kenya, but I'm gonna make a mistake. I can't remember. Jenna, oh God, the Hawaii apology. Hearing that as an elementary school kid made me ill. Oh, yeah. And Berna says, I'm going to read a book written by an English person taking place in the Ottoman Empire at the time. Green Mantle by John Buchan. Ooh, interesting one to see like the other viewpoint. Bermuda. Oh, Mark's Bermuda. Very cool. Yeah. So write a book and then we'll talk to you about it. Yeah, when you were talking about learning about the British Empire and the rising at school between your experience and your mother's experience, that made me think when I was doing research for my historical fiction, I remember reading in some contemporary novel about the 4% and being like, what is that? What is that? Guaranteed investment, because it's a crown fund for overseas colonies investments. So they were guaranteeing that people would get, a return on their investment for empire doings. And when I saw that, I was like, wow. Like, yeah, it's economics, like sort of crossing with the historical empire stuff, which was wild when I looked that up.
An example, I think the German Empire, they wanted to get in on the act, and they did in the 19th and early 20th century, and then it all got taken off them in the First World War. But they never made a profit out of their empire. It was the Germans. So Namibia was German. There was they had various bits of Africa and so on, because everybody wanted a bit of Africa in the 19th century, So, but it always actually kind of ran at a loss, which is intriguing. But it was but for them it was about, well, if France has got it and England's got it and Portuguese, the Portugal's got it, for goodness sake, then we want one.
Right. Yeah. Shannon saying it's funny, in Hawaii they teach Hawaiian history and not any U.S. history in 4th grade. I think that's national. Every kid in 4th grade does state history. That's all. I did California, and we did like mission projects. We did like little models of the California missions. Yeah. Small world. Bermudans in the house. There we go. They're also starting to teach native language dialects of the islands alongside English in younger grades. Very cool. Several reservation schools are doing the same. Really cool. Yeah. Get at that language early, because that's when you can actually retain it,
But also it means you have a sense of your distinct identity. Yeah. Language is so, it's what's, you know, like it's great speaking English because so many people speak English around the world, but actually it's so important that languages don't die. It's a sad thing every time a language dies.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So learn more. Learn more, everybody. All right. So we're going to be wrapping up. I'm going to go through the Storygraph challenge. Just to remind people, that's where you can put the books to apply to the prompts. It's on Storygraph. It's a great resource to track reading. Roz's prompt is on there, as well as all of the other BookTube celebrities that I asked to weigh in. And next week is the final prompt, the fifth weekend, the fifth weekend of May, where it's the other, and that is translated literature. So there's going to be a lot of crossover between 4 and 5, but we'll see what I come up with for that day. And let's see, the coming attractions. So that's the wrong one. That's the wrong. There we go. Coming attractions this Wednesday. Barrett was in the chat for a hot second, and I'm going to pop in. Let's see. We have 2 buddy reads for May of the Moderns to talk about. Monday, 7 p.m. Eastern, I believe. I'll be talking on Ben Pick's channel. Running. Oh, I'm getting too fast for myself here. About the Enchanted April. So he read it this year. I read it last year. And so we'll be chatting a little bit about that. It's taking a second. There we go. And then on Wednesday on my channel, I'll be talking with Barrett Laurie about The Octopus, which I am almost finished with. You can see I'm almost finished. I got plenty of tags in here. It's pretty tragic so far, as was his second novel. So his first one is shaping up pretty much the same. And it's super, super tense. So that's going to be an interesting one where we'll be talking about that Wednesday at 12 p.m. Pacific. Sorry to scallydandle with the time zones. And then our closing weekend, Friday and Saturday, we have our reading sprints. So that is how we will close out the month. And June 1st, I think we'll have our wrap-up party for anyone who wants to come on and talk about the books that they read or the experience of the readathon. You'll be welcome. So thank you so much, Roz. Thank you, everybody, for coming and participating and giving us great recommendations. I'll be checking those out and maybe popping links to whatever I find easily purchasable in the description in a moment. And hope this was enlightening for everybody and you're having a good time reading for May of the Moderns. So thank you, and I'll see you again soon. Bye, everybody.